All right, let's jump right into this explainer of the source material. Today, we're going on an absolutely incredible journey. We are traveling 9,400 years into the past, heading straight into the heart of the rugged Anatolian plateau to explore the astonishing Neolithic site of Çatalhöyük. We're going to dive right in because what we're about to see completely challenges everything we assume about how early humans lived together. Honestly, it might just make you rethink what a city even is. I want you to genuinely ask yourself this question and really try to picture it in your mind. Can you imagine a bustling, permanent settlement home to up to 8,000 people with absolutely no streets, no winding alleys, zero courtyards, and no front doors? It sounds like an absolute logistical nightmare to our modern minds, doesn't it? Like, how would you navigate? How on earth would you get home? But for 2,000 years, the people of Çatalhöyük didn't just survive. They thrived in a dense, fiercely egalitarian community built on exactly this layout. No palaces, no central administrative buildings, just thousands of homes packed tightly together. Looking at this aerial view of the East Mound over the Konya Plain, this 20-meter-high mound might just look like a natural hill blending into the landscape. But when British archaeologist James Mellart began excavating it back in the 1960s, it sent absolute shockwaves through the archaeological world. Why? Well, historically, we were always taught that complex human urbanization began strictly within the cradle of civilization, over in the Fertile Crescent, places like modern-day Iraq or Egypt. So finding a massive, sophisticated, densely populated community dating back over 9,000 years in central Turkey, that completely rewrote the timeline and the geography of human urbanization. It proved that complex human gatherings were happening much earlier and in entirely unexpected places. To really understand this society, we have to start our house tour at the very top. Section 1, houses entered from the roof. So, because there were literally zero streets on the ground level, the rooftops essentially served as the city's plaza, the highway system, and the main gathering space all rolled into one. People walked across these varied, stepped roof levels to get around town, basically navigating this giant sea of flat clay surfaces. To enter your home, you'd find your specific access hole, which brilliantly also served as the primary chimney for your indoor oven, and you'd climb down a steep wooden ladder into a windowless, densely packed mud brick house. Just imagine the sheer amount of neighborhood gossip, the daily chores, the tool-making, and the socializing happening right up there on the roof under the bright Anatolian sun, before everyone retreated into the cool, dark safety of the interior. Now that we've descended the ladder into the slightly smoky main room, let's look at Section 2, food, storage, and cooking. You can see here that they enjoyed a remarkably rich and varied diet that perfectly bridged the gap between ancient hunter-gatherer traditions and new agricultural innovations. They relied heavily on domesticated sheep and goats, which actually provided about 70% of their daily meat. But they were also brilliant, forward-thinking farmers. They cultivated emmer wheat, barley, peas, and lentils. What's super amazing is how they managed their food security. They stored vast amounts of these grains in designated, carefully crafted clay bins built right into the walls of the house. And they supplemented all of this by gathering almonds, wild seeds, and foraging for waterbird eggs from the nearby marshes, which proves they had a highly adaptable, really smart food strategy. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how they actually cooked this food, especially in the earlier periods, before fire-resistant pottery was widely perfected. They engineered these incredibly clever clay balls. Imagine weaving a tight, waterproof basket, filling it with water, meats, and grains, and then taking these clay balls, which had been superheated right in the hearth's glowing embers, and dropping them directly into the basket. The intense heat would transfer to the water instantly, boiling the stew and roasting the food without needing a pot that could withstand direct flame. It was just an ingenious feat of Neolithic domestic engineering. Let's shift our focus to Section 3, tools, weapons, and belongings. The absolute super material of the Neolithic world was obsidian. It's this dark, razor-sharp volcanic glass that produces an edge actually sharper than a modern surgical scalpel. But there were no volcanoes next door to the Konya Plain. The people of Çatalhöyük sourced their obsidian from Cappadocian volcanoes 190 kilometers away. Think about your longest daily commute for a second. Now imagine a 10 to 13-day journey on foot across rough terrain just to acquire raw materials. Families would bring back bags of unworked obsidian flakes and bury them in shallow pits near their hearths. When needed, they dig them up and meticulously nap them into sharp knives, arrowheads, spearheads for hunting and defense, and even highly prized, flawlessly polished obsidian mirrors. Now, despite this being a fiercely egalitarian society where houses were practically identical in size and wealth wasn't overtly hoarded, individuals absolutely had personal identities and prized possessions. They crafted these unique clay stamp seals called pintaderas. These featured intricate geometric basketwork patterns or animal shapes like bears and leopards. We believe they used these to stamp colorful dyes onto their textiles or maybe even to brand their daily loaves of bread. We've also discovered delicate bone awls for leatherworking, highly polished copper beads, and even a pierced leopard claw necklace. So personal flair and individual expression were very much alive and well 9,000 years ago. Looking up from the floor, our eyes are immediately drawn to Section 4, Wall Paintings and Reliefs. We are instantly struck by the incredibly vibrant, intense, and, well, somewhat intimidating art covering the plaster. The renowned archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler described it perfectly as a curious and sometimes macabre art. This wasn't just decorative wallpaper meant to make the room look pretty, folks. The imagery heavily focuses on themes of death, violence, and the teasing and baiting of oversized wild beasts like boars and stags. It is a stark, fascinating departure from earlier Paleolithic cave paintings where humans were just tiny figures in a vast natural world. Here, humans are depicted actively taunting, challenging, and trying to dominate the ferocious forces of nature. The sensory experience of a Çatalhöyük house must have been completely overwhelming. Walls were painted with bright red and black geometric patterns and covered in vivid, repetitive human handprints. Plaster benches and pillars had massive, actual wild bull horns called bucrania protruding right out of them, basically turning furniture into monuments of beasts. They molded massive splayed bear and leopard figures on the walls, often intentionally knocking the heads and feet off in ancient, mysterious closing rituals. They even embedded vulture skulls, fox teeth, and boar tusks directly into the wet plaster of the walls. They were literally building the intense danger of the wild right into the very fabric of their safe domestic spaces. And this brilliantly illustrates one of the greatest mysteries of Çatalhöyük. Just notice the stark contrast here between their spiritual lives and their daily realities. Their art and ritual life were completely dominated by dangerous wild animals. Wild cattle make up over half of their ritual bone deposits and reliefs. But their actual diet? Dominated by domestic, tame animals. They calmly ate domestic sheep every single day. But sheep barely show up in the artwork at all. It suggests this profound psychological separation. They worshipped, feared, and respected the fierce wild beasts in their ceremonies, but they practically survived on the docile, tame ones that they actually controlled. Finally, let's look beneath our feet for Section 5, Ancestors Under the House. This is undoubtedly the most shocking revelation of our entire Çatalhöyük house tour. I want to ask you a direct question. Where do you bury your loved ones when you lose them? Today, we use cemeteries, right? Places that are distinctly separated from our daily living spaces. We visit them occasionally. But at Çatalhöyük, there were no graveyards outside the city walls. They buried their dead directly under the white plaster floors of their houses, specifically right beneath the raised sleeping platforms where the family rested every single night. In some of the older, continuous houses, archaeologists have found up to 60 ancestors buried side by side beneath the floorboards. It represents a deeply spiritual, incredibly intimate, and continuous cycle of life and death. The ancestors weren't banished to the outskirts of town. They were kept actively involved in daily domestic life, in a practice that might seem, well, completely macabre to us today, but was deeply reverent and loving to them. They would sometimes carefully dig up the graves years later to remove skulls or limbs. These skulls were painted with red ochre, passed down through generations, circulated among the living during ceremonies, and eventually used in special foundation rituals when modifying the house. It basically ensured the original builders were always part of the home's literal and spiritual foundation. Let's move to and see how this builds, literally. A typical mud brick house lasted about 80 years, roughly the span of a human life back then. When it was time to rebuild, they didn't just pack up and move to an empty lot. Instead, they meticulously emptied the house of belongings and scoured the floors completely clean. They carefully dismantled the wooden roof and support posts so they could reuse them. Then, they intentionally crushed the upper mud brick walls, caving them in to fill the bottom half. This created a solid, compacted foundation over which they built the exact same house, right on top of the old one and right on top of their ancestors. Over thousands of years, this constant, rhythmic cycle of rebuilding layered houses on top of houses, generation after generation, kind of like tree rings, is exactly what created the massive 20-meter-high mound we see on the landscape today. It is a breathtaking, utterly unique way to organize a human society. So, as we wrap up this explainer of the source material, I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. Knowing about the intense, macabre art on the walls, the daily rooftop commutes under the baking Anatolian sun, and the generations of ancestors sleeping right beneath your bed, would you want to live in a city of 8,000 people with no doors entered solely from the roofs? It was an incredibly successful, highly adapted, egalitarian way of life that flourished for millennia. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the extraordinary world of Çatalhöyük, and keep exploring the fascinating echoes of our past.